Buenos Aires, PhD in University of Sapienza in Italy. She's a professor here at the UFRJ, University Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And she's in the research group on feminist economics in Rio de Janeiro. So, Margaritta,
thank you.
Floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, maybe good night. I am very happy to be here with such a wonderful colleagues and students and young scholars. It was very amazing to contribute and to be in these discussions. Today, as I said in the last 2 days, I'm given some doubts and concerns, not solutions. I am, as Camila says, I am pessimistic but hopeful. Maybe we can achieve some solutions sometime in the future. But I think that the 2 or 3 points that I want to think with you and share with you has to do with my concerns not being from the finance sector or finance research and not being from the environmental research. I am from feminist economics, and my approach and my lenses of understanding the society and the system are from there. So my proposal today is to talk about climate change and development strategies from this specific perspective. I am from UFM, which is the research group in feminist economics here at the Institute of Economics of the UFRJ, but I am part of the feminist network, Brazilian feminist network on feminist economics. So we had some publication and a recent book. I'm going to speak about this research and another research that I made together with Camila about the big push and the gender issues on the big push. So, okay, in the last 2 days we have been discussing about the emergency, about the situation, about the extreme events. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but it's evident that problems in Argentina, this is Bahía Blanca in the beginning of the year, Europe and the fire here in Brazil last year and Argentina also, a lot of different hydric emergency in Uruguay and here in Beaga, which was mainly the most catastrophic event in Brazil in the last times. So we are in a situation of emergency. It's deniable, and I think that, of course, that we talk about the rising contamination and so on, and we know that since Industrial Revolution the situation is worsened and we are at the moment, maybe at the turning point moment, but the main thing that I want to talk with you is that different from the common views on the human interaction with the earth and so on, I want to give some perspective from the systemic approaches. So I think that thinking about the terricide, the ecocide, thinking about the Capitalocene, from the Capitalocene category could be very useful in order to understand how to achieve or how to resolve this emergency situation. You know, as Camila said yesterday, according to the last IPCC laboratory, we have the situation that after 10 years of international efforts, we are in a worse pattern than 10 years ago. So even if the climate change is in the agenda, even if the emergency, the climate emergency is a very well-known aspect, the situation is that the system is not dealing with it. And when the system is dealing with it, the solutions that the system offers in general had a lot of problems. So from my viewpoint, I really consider such as Fraser and the William Moore said, we are in a multifaceted crisis. It's not only a climate crisis, and in a crisis from the capitalism. We are in a crisis characterized as a crisis of production, crisis of consumption, crisis of the system, and a crisis of reproduction. We are, so in that sense, very constrained by the fact that in the way in which the system is working, different solutions are very difficult. So we are in a system that I consider that is a capitalistic, patriarchal, with the colonial power structure still working and still menacing the fact that how production, distribution, and the power is organized. In that sense, I think that at least what I want to, or try to do, is to change, to shift focus, locus, and the relationship. I think that the relationship that the system has with nature, with the environment and so on is really predatory. In fact, we continue to consider, and the economists are maybe worse in that sense, but because we continue to consider the nature as a resource, we continue to consider that this resource is there for us, and our relationship is really anthropocentric and with a hierarchical relation with nature and earth and so on. I want to think in terms, so in order to understand the problems that I consider when I am thinking about sustainability and just transition and green economics and so on, I mainly want to focus on two of them. One of them is neocolonialism, and the problem of neocolonialism that arises from the fact that the solutions of capitalism are focusing in this decarbonization, net zero, and so on, from the capitalistic point of view. In that sense, I put this Schultz Solar work of art, which is the dragon, painted by Schultz Solar in 1927, and the situation remains the same after 100 years. So I think that a common question these days have been, who are our allies? Who are our options? Which are our options? And I continue to think that Latin American and Global South coordination and so on could be a way. However, I think that within capitalism, just solution is very difficult. In particular, to my understanding today, Global North is proposing energetic transition, call it sometimes just transition, and even more green economics. The main problem of that has to do with this potential problem with neocolonialism, that is a new way of appropriation of our land, our resources, and the relation between global north and global south. A big issue that I understand that we have is that in general when we study finance and sustainability and the finance of sustainability, global architecture and so on, we are in this focus in the global north, global south relations and the geopolitics and geoeconomics of that. In particular, I think that a big problem has to do with the shift in the providers of this energetic, not contaminating minerals and fuels. For example, we think, of course, that we need to move from fossil fuels to other not contaminating mineral solutions. However, the main problem is that these clean solutions are using much more minerals than any other fossil fuel. So we have a problem there. On the one hand, for example, an electric car requires more than six times more minerals than any other conventional car. Onshore wind plant requires 9 times more mineral resources than a gas-fired plant. Okay, we need more minerals. What's the problem? The problem has to do with who has these minerals, which changes in the geoeconomics and the structure of power emerge from this shift, from this change, and which are the concerns and the potential problems that we can face if not specific solutions with this in mind are taking place. So, for example, we have here which kind and how many minerals are used for a conventional car and electrical car. We had a lot of fuels and different in offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, etc. We can see that the requirement, the demand for minerals is huge, and if we analyze from where, I think that Laura presented this very well, from where these extractions come from, the role of the global south is evident. And as I said in my intervention yesterday during the presentation of Camila's, the main problem is what happened with the arise of the neoliberal right-wing governments, which are very supported by multinationals and rich people as Elon Musk. The relationship between Elon Musk and Milei is not just a relation because they are very good friends or they have a, I don't know, a zodiac similar path. The relationship between them has to do with this neocolonial and this need of getting into these specific minerals. No, you know, it's Chile with copper, lithium with Argentina, Bolivia, and the triangle of the lithium, and what happens with the all the minerals in Africa, Latin America, and the South Cone, and the fact that China has a huge relation with the processing of these minerals. So what is happening in the war between the US and China and the relation between Trump and Xi Jinping nowadays? So there are things that we should start to think about it. I have not the solution, but I am just seeing a big problem there. On the other hand, and that's a very interesting thing, the why the agenda of green economics and this renewal hope in industrial policies are gaining place in the global north? It has to do not because they are really concerned about environment. I think that it has to do with the fact, with the need of deal with this huge problem of unemployment, deindustrialization, and so on that they are living. They are facing as a result of this neoliberal phase of the capitalism. The internalization of the production and the localization and the global value chains and so on create huge problems for Europe and from the United States. The first Trump was the result of that. The second Trump continued to be a result of that. And even Biden was really afraid with the problem. For example, this is a position that Sheikh Sullivan took in 2023 that he said in the name of oversimplified market efficiency, inter-supply chains along with industry and job were allocated abroad. The assumption that deep trade liberalization would help the US export goods, not jobs, was a promise he made, but not kept. So they want to deal with this, the industrialization, with this unemployment, with this huge problem of fentanyl, drug addiction of the US population, and so on. And IRAD and the Green New Deal have a solution for that. So I think that it appears as a solution for environmental problems, but at the end, the real motivation there is the need of go back to a more protective industrial development strategy. In fact, I think that they are pursuing this protection, this green protection, and my main question is, are they going to kick away the green ladder as they do with the industrial strategies in the beginning of the 90s and the 20s and so on? So they are talking about green economics. To what extent the Global South is going to have this possibility? To what extent these industrial strategies, green industrial strategies and so on, are possibilities for Global South? I think that Brazil has a situation very different from the rest of Latin America and Africa. The rest of Latin America and Africa are much more dependent, for example, on the Chinese investments in the new road of Seda. Road. Thank you. So, external constraints, development, industrial strategies for Latin America, Africa are much more difficult. It is possible for us to have these huge investments as the green economics, and I am not talking about this as a way of dealing with net zero and decarbonization. That's another discussion. Is, as Lars says, this is a window for industrialization, but it's a window for us. Is that really happening? Because on the other hand, we have the international financial system pushing fiscal equilibrium, structural adjustment, and so on. So, to what extent we have the possibility of finance this green economics? And finally, I don't know how much time I have left, but finally, let's suppose that we have this possibility to finance green economics, to pursue this big push, to go to these huge investments in more sustainable technologies and so on. To what extent feminized bodies, racialized bodies, peripheral bodies are affected and are part of the solution? Of course, that I don't want to enter a lot, but because we discussed this in the last 2 days, I think that Camila put this very clear. We are facing this environmental racism and sexism. I'm going to briefly speak why I think that there is an environmental sexism also, in which some specific groups are much more affected for these extreme events. In the case of feminized bodies, I think that the fact has to do with our role in the social division of labor. Women are in charge of the reproduction of the working force and the reproduction of life. In this sense, we are in charge, not by decision, but by imposition of the system. We are in charge of care. In that sense, every time that we face an extreme event, women are much more affected than the rest of the population. And that was very, very clear during the pandemics. The increase in the time poverty, which is the time that everyone has. If women are using much of our time in taking care of the rest of the houses, of the people, of the child, of the sick, of the working force and so on, of course, we have much less time than any other integrant of the society. We have an intensification of care work in front of any kind of extreme event, because we have to clean the houses, we have to take care of the illness and so on. We have the situation of isolation and a very huge increase in violence. So this is one way in which feminized bodies are much more exposed to extreme events. But on the other hand, we have also the labor market situation. Women in labor market, at least in Global South, are in a much more precarious situation than anyone else. The vulnerability of the jobs are huge. The women are the first one that lose their jobs when a crisis happens. And in the domestic negotiation of who has to leave the market, the job market, in the case of increase in domestic demand, of course, women having lower wages and worse situation and so on, are the first one to be at home. This was also a very clear result of the pandemic, in which more women, in the case of Brazil, more women were outside the job market than inside the job market. So that was a historical result since the 70s. That doesn't happen. So we have two ways in which women are much more affected by these external events. And the main problem is that decarbonization and the solutions of this so-called climate justice are not considering, or much of the times are not considering these specific characteristics. So, for example, the investment in mitigation and adaptation are not including the fact that these policies are not neutral. So, in this, it's not a paper, it's like 100 pages of work that we made with CEPAL and the FES, which is the dimension of gender in a big push. We analyze different dimensions, and I want to share with you two specific ones that I think that are very illustrating. The first one has to do with urban mobility. The first solution that we listen for the zero emission is, okay, we need to shift our transport system from an electric transport system and reducing the blah, blah, blah. But the problem is that if we think from the point of view of how the care system and the women in the society moves and relocate and so on, we have a very clear different pattern from male to female delocalization. So, for example, the male in general moves from house to the job and goes back. When the women are going to, okay, sorry, this is in Spanish, Portuguese, I don't know, but from the home to the job, and then to the market, and then to the school, and then to the bank, and to the hospital, and so on, every single day. So it's not sufficient, it's not enough to have electric buses. We need to have a system of a mobile system thinking about care. Here, Rio de Janeiro is the worst example of that. Maybe to do all of these movements for care, we should use, I don't know, 5 different buses, 2 buses, 1 metro, 1 train, 1, because the city is not thinking from this. So if we are thinking about justice, justice is not only electric mobility, it's a care mobility. On the other hand, and I think that is the most controversial thing, has to do with green economics, green jobs. In the green jobs, or even if we have a huge discussion, what is a green job? And nobody knows, and nobody can answer this question. If we consider we are here presenting 2 different, in this work we are presenting 2 different categorizations. If we consider the participation of women in formal jobs of the categories of employments related with green sectors, women are only in telecommunications, which is a terrible sector regarding the hours you work, the conditions, and so on. So in all of the sectors that are characteristic of the green economics, we have white male workers. If we are focusing all our economic efforts in develop these sectors, the inequality is going to rise. There is no other option. If in the construction, within the construction of industrial green policies, we are not including how women, black people, and so on are going to be incorporated and be the focus of this new job creation, the solution is not equal or just at all. This is a bigger one. Just to say to you, the main sectors that have more than 25% of women participation are cleaning in domestic houses, cleaning universities and all other kind of public sectors, and civil rights. So the only 3 sectors of non-specific, which is altogether put it there. The only 3 sectors in which women are more representatives or of the sectors that are characteristic of regional economics, it has to be, are related with cleaning, are related with this division of labor, historical division of labor. So, to conclude, if we are thinking in just transition, we need to increase, I think, at least 3 things should be considered. The first of them is the participation of women and racialized women in the construction of these policies, in the construction of these decision-making spaces. We need to have a very functioning care policy. Today, Brazil is discussing it, actually approved the integral plan from care, however, without budget, without a very clear way of how they are going to finance that. And we need to create some more digital inclusion, STEM inclusion, introduce women and racialized people in the areas that are fundamental for these green jobs and so on. So that was more or less my 2 big issues that I want to share with you. These are the 2 papers or part of chapters that inspired this intervention. So much.
Thank you, Margaritta. We're now moving to the next presentation. It will be Carola Mejía. Carola, it's yours. So Carola is a Bolivian economist, master in economics of development with a specialty in sustainable development and environment from the Institute of Social Studies in Holland. She has more than 15 years of experience as an advisor for public and international cooperation organizations, working on issues related to climate change, sustainable development, climate finance, and climate justice. She worked as climate finance analyst for almost 3 years in the Latin American Network for Economic and Social Justice, Latindadd, and since last year, she's coordinator of the area of climate justice, transition, and the Amazon of Latin. See?
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to this. It's very interesting to hear all the ideas, debates that we have been hearing since yesterday. On behalf of Latindadd, we are very grateful, and we hope this presentation also brings some important topics to the discussions, especially related to the new international financial architecture, which is something that we hear a lot. If we can go to yes. There is a call for a new financial architecture, especially since 2022. We have been seeing these initiatives, like, for example, the Bridgetown initiative promoted by a small Caribbean island, Barbados, and Mia Motley in the international spaces. It was a very interesting proposal, but unfortunately she was co-opted by big powers like France and other countries that made her move backwards a little bit in her proposals. But then we heard in 2023 the United Nations, the UN Secretary General, describing the international financial architecture as outdated, dysfunctional, and unjust, which is failing the mission to provide a global safety net for developing countries. And he called for a deep structural reform and a new Bretton Woods moment. So, if you can go to the next one. But the international financial architecture goes beyond the Bretton Woods institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. According to UNCTAD, this financial architecture is a framework of institutions, policies, rules, practices that govern the global financial system. It aims to promote international cooperation with the view of ensuring global monetary and financial stability, enabling international trade and investment, supporting the mobilization of stable and long-term financing required for economic development, combating the climate change, the climate crisis, and achieving the sustainable development goals. It's very broad. These systems should be doing that, but we can clearly see it's not working. And yesterday we heard Cepal talking about the status of the 2030 agenda and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Unfortunately, time is running out to fulfill these goals. Only 23% of them are on track, and we are really running out of time. But there is also a huge financial gap. Developing countries face a 4.2 trillion annual financial gap. So where is this money will come from? Especially in a context where we have the United States withdrawing from international agreements like the Paris Agreement and other United Nations spaces. When the US is leaving these spaces, we have the European Union saying that they are going to redirect money that was going to these agendas to their own defense, so military expenditure. And we have the situation of our region. We are a region where all our countries are middle-income countries because of an indicator by the World Bank that measures this related to the net national income. So even IT in Latin America is a middle-income country. And what does that represent? It represents that we have a lot of challenges and limitations to access low-cost and very concessional funding from outside. And when debt relief initiatives were in place after the pandemic, we couldn't be part of that because we are supposed to be middle-income countries that don't need that kind of support. So that is something that needs to change as well. But we are also facing increasing debt levels and borrowing costs. If we can go to the next one, please. In the last UNCTAD report related to debt, we can see the global public debt, which surpasses the $100 trillion in 2024. Especially after the pandemic, it has been growing a lot, especially in our region. In the world, there are 60 countries that are highly indebted. 10 of them are in our region. And in 2023, to give you a figure, Latin America and the Caribbean's total debt reached almost $5.8 trillion. So this debt is huge. It is becoming very difficult to pay and repay. And also, developing countries pay higher borrowing costs than countries like the US, as we can see in this graph. We are paying higher borrowing costs. If we can go to the next one. But there is another challenge. The structure of the creditors is changing as well. Now, the main creditors of Latin America and the Caribbean are private creditors, 74% in 2021. 22% are multilateral creditors, NBs and other funds, and only 4% are bilateral creditors. So this is changing a lot, and that makes things even more difficult for us. If you can go to the next one, please. But what does it imply to have a huge debt? It implies many things. For example, it implies greater pressure for our countries to keep investing in extractive sectors. Because this debt comes in dollars, in foreign currency, we need the foreign currency to repay it. And how we get this foreign currency? We have to invest in mining, hydrocarbons, agribusiness, and the sectors that have been historically the ones that our economy relies. But this dependency and the huge debt makes us go deeper into these extractive sectors and extractivism. But it's not only that global countries that are highly indebted choose to go into extractivism to repay their debts and avoid default. It is also because of the IMF pressure. If your country has a program with the IMF, they say you have to exploit the hydrocarbons for example, in Argentina, Vaca Muerta, because we want you to repay the debt. That's the only thing they care. But we also have pressure from the credit rating agencies, Moody's, and in these other independent credit rating agencies. And I will give an example of Ecuador, which is similar to what Daniel was mentioning about the Yasuni, but this is a different case because it's more recent. There was a public consultation related to the exploitation of hydrocarbons in the Amazon, in a part of the Amazon region in Ecuador, and the people voted no. They didn't want that part to be touched. And it was an historical, very important process. But what happened a day after that? Moody's approached the Ecuadorian government and they threatened the government and said, if you respect that result, we are going to downgrade your rating. So they are punishing a government and a country that has like a national will to not do something, and that is part of that system, of that unfair financial system that is keeping us in this role of just exporters of commodities and raw materials. But there is also this case of Suriname that we have analyzed last year. It is very interesting because Suriname had a huge debt after the pandemic, and some private creditors of Eurobonds approached them and offered a restructuring of the debt. But what was the condition? They said, we are going to restructure your debt, but you have to start exploiting hydrocarbons in this place, offshore. And you will pay us royalties. And at the end, they are going to earn more than the original bond. So it is another way of using that to pressure our countries to keep in this path of extractivism. And that's what we have called this vicious circle between extractivism, climate crisis, and external debt. And in this QR, you can find 6 reports. We have analyzed 5 Amazon countries. Brazil is not part of that because Brazil has a different problem related to debt. It is not mostly external debt, there's more internal debt. But there is a case of Ecuador, Bolivia, Peru, Suriname, and Colombia. So if you are interested, you can download the reports. The next one, please. But also, greater debt service implies less public money to invest in climate mitigation, adaptation, and the SDGs, the 2030 agenda. There are some austerity measures imposed to our countries when we are highly indebted and we get to these programs related to IMF, for example. And the first thing that you cut are social and environmental expenditures. And some examples, Latin America spends 3 times more on debt service than on health and education. And Latin American countries are spending more on debt service than on climate action. And this table shows some data from Colombia, Peru, and Suriname, showing what percentage of the budget goes to debt service to repay the debt, and how much is going to environmental spending. You can see a huge gap. The next one, please. But we were also talking in this event about climate finance. And climate finance is supposed to be helping us, but it's not. It's really increasing the debt levels in the country because 2/3 of climate finance are loans. And in Latin America, 81% are loans. So that is super unfair. And even for adaptation, they are giving us loans that we have to repay with their interest rates. So at the end, the global south countries are unfairly paying for the climate debt of the countries. Even with high interest rates, they are making profit of it. It's another unfair way of saying of having this problem. And there are some studies that I would recommend if you're interested that said that the higher the climate vulnerability of a country, the higher the interest rate they charge you. So they punish us for being climate vulnerable. Instead of really helping us, they are pushing us. And of course, we have also in this report some measures about the economic losses due to climate change. And they are being covered with more debt because right now that is the way, that is the only instrument available to really cover. And now we're not talking about loss and damage, we're talking about debt and damage. And there's a new fund, yes, a new loss and damage fund, but it's not operative yet. It is going to be loans as well. And it's, under the World Bank, and it's going to be very difficult to have it as a fair instrument. And something we were discussing also yesterday, the role of multilateral development banks. There is a call to have a stronger role of these development banks, but they are mostly providing non-concessional loans. And this is the information I was giving yesterday. 89% are loans, and from those loans, 73 are non-concessional, so not good conditions for our countries. So if we are pushing for a stronger role of these banks, the debt problem is going to increase as well. And they are not going to solve that problems. And there are also criticism related to these banks keep investing in positive sectors, the risky approach that they are mostly using and mostly funding mitigation projects. While in the case of Latin America, adaptation should be the priority. There is not enough money for adaptation. And we have the FFD process. Within the United Nations, there is a process of financing for development that we have been following closely. There is a civil society mechanism that we are part of. It is a big network of organizations that have been following the different topics and negotiations so far. And that is the space where this process is key to guarantee funding for the SDGs, the 2030 agenda, but not only that. it could be a space for deciding on systemic reforms of international financial architecture. Countries get together to discuss debt, to discuss tax, to discuss trade, to discuss systemic issues, to discuss the role of multilateral development banks, the role of the private sector. So it is a very important space that we have been following. And we had recently, a few weeks ago, we have been in Spain, in Seville, in the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development. And there was a central demand to strengthen multilateralism in that conference because we can see what is happening in the world. Multilateralism is weakening, and that is a huge risk. But also, public debt was a key issue in this negotiation. So I will share a little bit of what happened with the debt problem and a proposal we had from Global South countries and also from some bloc of countries negotiating this process. There was the African group, AOSIS, the small island states, Egypt, Brazil, Pakistan, and Cuba, demanding the creation of a United Nations Framework Convention for Sovereign Debt. So debt problems are not going to be discussed and debated in closed doors of rich countries clubs like the Paris Club or G20, that these institutions have been created by rich countries. But we were proposing to discuss that problem in a multilateral space that could bring this principle of justice, democracy, equity, where one country has one vote, not $1 makes one vote. And so we wanted to change the international governance, the economic governance, but unfortunately this proposal was not adopted. But we will keep pushing for something like that because the Sevilla Commitment, which is the document that resulted from this negotiation, upholds the dominance of the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, the Paris Club, and the G20 and the global policies under a non-binding agreement. And that's something we don't want anymore. We want really serious negotiations where other countries in the South have the same voice and right to demand and propose solutions, not only receive ineffective mechanisms, like for example the common framework or some proposal which G20 has given us to tackle the debt problem, but it's not working. The debt swaps, and Daniel mentioned some problems that we have analyzed in the recent debt swap in the Galapagos. And I will add to what you said that they are not effective either, because after 1 year we didn't see $1 moving to climate conservation. So they are dangerous as well. And something I will say that you didn't mention, that I don't know if it's completely related to that or not, is that after the Galapagos deal, the United States established a military base in Galapagos. And there was a financial institution of the United States being part of the deal, of the swap. So it also implies different things related to sovereignty that could be very harmful for a country. So there haven't been really good proposals or really structural changes in this fourth International Conference for Financing for Development, and the current architecture will continue to reproduce these inequalities and exclude the most affected that you were mentioning, women, but also indigenous communities, the youth, and people that is not part of those processes but receive the direct impacts of these decisions. But there are some windows of opportunity that we see from that process that happened in Sevilla some weeks ago that we will keep pushing for. For example, the document proposes the creation of an intergovernmental process on debt under the auspices of the UN. The bad thing is that the countries are countries, creditors, and other stakeholders are invited to be part of that, but it's not binding. They are not. Some of them are going to be out of that space. There was also the establishment of a debtors forum to enhance coordination among borrowing countries, which could be helpful. The promotion of responsible borrowing and lending principles, what could be helpful. A review of debt sustainability analysis. The IMF has a methodology for the debt sustainability analysis that only focuses on the country repaying the debt, but it excludes completely the other important vulnerability elements like climate vulnerability, social vulnerability, gender equities. They are not part of that kind of analysis, and there's a call to review this kind of analysis. There's a call to create a more transparent global debt data registry hosted by the World Bank. There are some proposals of debt service standstill clauses in the event of climate-related events, disasters, and shocks. When something like that happens, your country can stop paying the debt, which is something that has some that could be helpful. And also reducing the cost of financing by encouraging creditors to lend in local currency. I heard here that Brazil receives local currency as debt. Our countries don't. Our countries receive loans in dollars, and unfortunately that is causing a lot of problems. And if you can go to the next one. There's a need of, there's also in the document the need for indicators that go beyond the GDP, the gross domestic product, to reflect the economic, social, and climate dimensions of sustainable development. That will be very important for Latin American countries. As I was mentioning at the beginning, all of our countries have been already categorized as middle-income countries, even IT. So that is because of this use of this indicator related to the GDP, to the net national income. That is completely, that doesn't show the multiple vulnerabilities and problems, structural problems our countries have. And I will also mention this, the last one, the development of a special drawing rights playbook. For Latindadd, the special drawing right could be a key element in financing the sustainable agenda and the climate agenda. If I say to you that, if you don't know the special drawing rights, that you have the possibility of creating money in a moment of crisis, would you believe me fast just because of political will? There is this instrument. It's a decision that the IMF takes. It happened after the pandemic. They have a decision of, okay, we will issue 650 million SDRs that were then converted to national money. Unfortunately, the distribution criteria is wrong, it's unfair. 2/3 came to the global north and only 1/3 came to the south. And we, Latindadd, did a lot of analysis of how useful were those resources in Latin America and in Africa, and they were very useful, and they didn't imply debt, they didn't imply conditionalities. So why don't we think about yearly annual issuances of special drawing rights for the climate agenda, for the 2030 agenda? You can go to the next one, these are other proposals, debt relief for countries in need, and I know governments can sometimes ask for those things, but the church and the civil society have a big campaign this year because it's the year of Jubilee, 2025, and it happened 25 years ago. My country, Bolivia, has benefited from a debt relief process in the HIPIC because of this campaign. So it can happen again. We have to reform the current climate finance architecture. It is mostly going through loans, mitigation is the one prioritized. It takes 5 years to have one project approved by the Green Climate Fund, so it's not working as the emergency really requires. There is just only 10% going as direct access for the people that need most, and that is in the front line of the emergency. But we have to reform also the financial institutions. There's an NDP reform, to reform the IMF quota, to regulate or create. There was a proposal to create a credit rating agency within the United Nations because they are not really fair with us. They are really independent institutions that are just responding to the interests of the North. There are some tax justice instruments, progressive taxes, especially to fossil fuel corporations, taxing the wealth, which was a proposal by Brazilian government in the G20. And to give more importance to life sustainability than debt sustainability. That is a key message of a campaign we have. I already mentioned the special drawing rights and redirect military expenditures and fossil fuel subsidies to climate action. When we go to these negotiations, global north countries say there is not enough public money, but the public money is there. Can you see? In 2024, global military expenditure reached $2.46 trillion. Global fossil fuel subsidies amounted 7 trillion in 2022. Between 21 and 32 trillion in financial assets are held in tax havens that should disappear as well. Every year, 408 billion in tax are lost due to tax abuse. No? And we can see these measures also affecting our countries in the fiscal budget we need. But I will finish here. There is something that's important too. We are trying to develop narratives and counter-narratives. And who owes who? We have talked about the financial debt, but there is also this ecological and climate debt that these global north countries that are our main creditors and the ones ruling these institutions and the economic system, they have and they owe us a huge debt. And we can clearly see that the United States in the first place of this ranking. And I really recommend, if you are interested in climate justice, to read the report of Jason Hickel. He has a very interesting approach of really estimating this responsibility. 92% of excess carbon emissions come from the global north, and they have to pay. And if you can go to the next one. But they unfortunately are the ones putting them for rules. They are using debt as a neocolonial instrument to keep our countries in this path of extractivism and to be conditioned forever. And they are really not pushing for the real solutions, and that is something that we need to know. It is not a matter of solidarity or charity that they give us. It is a matter of climate justice and reparations that we are really demanding. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Carola. Last but not least, this panel on proposals for social justice, gender issues, and debt sustainability among international financial architecture. We will have Charles Abugre. Charles is the Executive Director of IDEAS, former Director of the UNDP for Africa, Ghana's National Development, he's part of the Ghana's National Development Planning Commission. So, Charles will
I am now the one standing between you and Caparina. So I shall hurry up. The focus of my presentation is on the institutional architecture. Before you all get tired, it makes 4 main points. One, that architecture is highly fragmented at a global level, hardly coordinated. 2, this put together entire ecosystem generates highly inadequate volumes for climate and development financing, whilst exacerbating the debt crisis, as Carola has spoken about. 3rd point, but there are shoots of innovation in the system. And those innovations lie at the regional and national levels. And it is at the regional and national levels that perhaps our attention for institutional architectural reforms that can make a difference should be focused. There are 2 number of reasons for this. One, at least at the national and regional level, countries of the global south has a lot more control over what they can do or not do, even within the context of legalized finance, constraints that are imposed by legalized finance. But we have options that may be politically painful, but we could handle that to various forms of capital controls, but also that the international global financial institutions, reforms of them can only be limited because they are basically instruments of global political economy. Okay, so those are my 4 main points. You may now go to sleep. So next, the architecture. This is taken from the Climate Finance Monitoring Report that is routinely produced by Henry Boll and Oak Foundation, which is a German organization, and ODI. We've adapted this. This basically traces the, links the flows, institutional flows, the mechanisms that are being used at the global level. We inserted the developing country public finance framework to it. the story it tells is a very complex system. And reforming it requires, and each of these bits of the system has different constraints and opportunities for reform. If you add to this the emerging innovations, which are largely at regional level, such as regional lenders of last resort and bilateral currency swaps, development of regional and cross-regional payment settlement systems, importance of working with national currencies, which are current conversations about how to address the foreign exchange related external debt problem, cross-border payments and settlement systems, focus on national financial institutions for tapping into pension funds and other long-term savings instruments, local currency bonds. I'm adding basically to the existing international architecture these various innovations and emerging shoots of innovations that apply at regional and national levels. Next, I think we've had quite a bit of discussion on the scale and volumes of these resources that we anticipate for both climate and development finance. The projection by G20 of about $3 trillion of financial resources by 2030 is broadly divided, twice as much of it to be mobilized domestically and one externally. As we can already see, the external sources will never be met. The burden for development financing and climate financing falls nationally. Next. Now, in terms of the external sources of finance, most of it is channeled through NDBs. Bilateral finance is predominantly, increasingly now, through loans, and that point has been made. The multilateral development finance even more dominated by debt instruments. And channeled through multilateral development banks. Multilateral climate funds have more grants in them, but they are not a lot of money. And you can see that from the next channel, which is that it is the Bretton Woods bodies that dominate the climate finance to multilateral development banks, but they either provide for the IDA with the shock loan angle, the one that fairly divides its funds between adaptation and mitigation. Only the American Development Bank actually provides joint loans that's to portfolios for both mitigation, complementary loans for both mitigation and adaptation. It is the climate funds, other multilateral institutions such as the GEF do have a more balanced portfolio, but the money is small. So the money that is channeled at international level goes to predominantly the Bretton Woods institutions, maybe the World Bank, and to some extent the regional development banks. Now, as I initially said, the bulk of the burden for financing climate mitigation and adaptation lies at the domestic level, and but that also go for both official funds as well as private funds. So the national development financial institutions at the national level carry the burden of the climate financing at the domestic level. Next. Now, I think Carola said a lot about the debt issue. There's another visual cycle associated with debt, which is the relationship between the cost of debt the fiscal space for adaptation and mitigation, rising vulnerability, and rising climate risks. So it becomes a issue. The debt burden is quite highly concentrated, with Africa and Southeast Asia in particular carrying most of that external debt burden. And most of that external debt burden is increasingly commercial. I think that point has been made. Not only is it commercial, it's very short-term commercial at very high costs, largely drawn from Eurobonds. The space for development financing and investment, long-term investment within that kind of factor of financing is very limited. At the same time, it squeezes, because of the short duration of these loans, it squeezes any fiscal space for allocation of domestic resources for development. I think that point also has been made. The point in this slide is simply the gap that exists between what is necessary in the future that needs to be financed for to drive towards net zero carbon emission, and what is currently the trajectory of climate finance. Point being made here is, for as long as there is shortfall, the shortfall reinforces itself, making the future burden for reaching net zero even more daunting. So the more it is longer it is postponed, the more difficult it becomes to actually raise the resources necessary to invest towards net zero. That's generally the nature of the climate finance. But in terms of the reform architecture for that ecosystem, that architecture is also quite complex. It involves the governance, reform of the governance of the public international financial institutions, such as the multilateral development banks and the IMF. I think that point has been made, as well as other international public development bodies. The reform has been slow and will continue to be slow. The reason, as I have made in the introductory remarks, is that these are geopolitical institutions. They are institutions of the United States and the winners of the Second World War. It is irrespective of the change in the structure of the global economy. It does significant reform to redistribute voice and control means taking power from those who created it and who use it as an instrument for exerting power. And so we can only be modest about what is possible in terms of reforming the World Bank, the IMF, and so on. Secondly, it also involves the role of financial standard setters that establish norms for the governance of private finance. It involves monetary arrangements related to the global financial safety net. It involves informal country groupings that act as norm setters, such as the group of 7 and the group of 20. It involves the credit groups, credit rating agencies, point has been made on that. It involves the reform of the United Nations itself as a norm setter and implementer, but also as HORA for coordination and problem solving. But the United Nations itself, as you can see, is itself an instrument of geopolitical power. And so the ability to reform those are also as constrained as the space for reforming the financial institutions. So a balanced approach to global, global, regional, and national institutional architecture is important going forward. And in that regard, in terms of reforms of the multilateral development banks, there are 4 significant institutional challenges. First is the lack of adequate representation. I think that point has also been made. Significant share of investment loans at climate finance and is in debt, that form of debt, that point has been made. A low share of finance going to climate vulnerable countries, and concerns about the responsiveness or policy advice, the conditions of developing countries, which also impact on project sustainability. Basically, the technical assistance industry, and so on. But there are opportunities for reforms, and we should prioritize collaborations, new instruments, including the guarantees and shaping the sustainable blending and de-risking discussions and contribution to reducing the cost of capital. That should be a focus of reforms for as much as it's possible to do. Public de-risking, I think the point that Jakarta has been making, so to pivot from de-risking just private capital to seeing how to de-risk public capital, how to de-risk state-owned enterprises to invest for public goods. Increase support to project and pipeline development and implementing the G20 capital adequacy framework and so on. So there are in this institutional multilateral development fund some areas which when we prioritize might have some benefits. In terms of the financial architecture, we propose a balanced approach to global, regional, and national levels. There is a gradual but strategic shifts in financing institutional arrangements, especially regional arrangements and regional cooperation arrangements. And there are a number of examples which we have flagged. There's no time to go through them. And there are at the national level, a focus on ecosystems and productive finance. And it is in this area that the greatest attention ought to be paid for regulatory reforms, for capital, focus on international financial new generation for sovereign wealth funds as a possibility, and we should flag this. So on this next, so I can speed up on that map. Yeah. So if you look at our regions, and each of these regions, there are new and interesting regional arrangements that are important for raising resources, but also for building the regional and national institutional capacity and capabilities for continued raising of resources. So, this is the case across all three major regions of the global south. Even the poorest regions, such as Africa, is building this African financing stability mechanism. It will be launched this year. There is an Arab Monetary Fund. It is quite significant. We have the Chiang Mai initiative, and so on. It is these various regional initiatives. They are, still small, but they are growing. And some greater attention to how to grow these initiatives, how to facilitate regional collaboration to grow them, and to operate across countries in each region holds great promise going forward. And in the African context, we looked at Africa partly because of it's the place where the rubber hits the ground in terms of financing climate. And as you can see, the cost of private capital and or debt capital has been rising, especially since the early 2000s when concessionary finance shrunk, and all of these economies, low middle income countries, shifted to private finance. The cost of borrowing has been growing. There's a whole conversation about a special African tax on capital. But on the other side, a recent study by an African infrastructure group also showed that actually within the African continent there is over $2.4 trillion of capital. Where is it sitting? It's sitting in pension funds, it's sitting in insurance companies, and it's sitting in various other forms of long-term savings mobilization. Some of it is sitting in state-owned enterprises. The challenge is how to create opportunities to channel, mobilize, and grow these sources of domestic resources, for climate and development finance. Next. But the architecture for raising capital and institutional players in many of these countries is also more complex than looks, because in these countries, the players are varied. So if you look at Seychelles, for example, Seychelles has quite a large, one second. So the blue one are government securities. So the violet is listed equities. So each of these countries have different mix of capital. In some places, real estate is a major source. The real estate players are the major mobilizers of capital. And in other places, it is equities in companies and so on. It is understanding this mix of domestic capital sources that is important for growing the domestic space for capital. Secondly, there is potential for building sovereign wealth funds. Very poorly harnessed. There are only 2 countries on the African continent that are actually focusing a lot on managing and growing their sovereign wealth funds. That is Libya, which is now totally shattered as a country, it's a failed state, but it still has sovereign wealth fund. A lot of it is frozen in Europe, but it remains. The other is Ethiopia. Ethiopia is growing its sovereign wealth fund, and so is Angola. So Angola, Nigeria, and countries like that have capabilities and potential for growing their own sovereign wealth funds, applying that into domestic investment for both transformation and green transition. Okay, so there are various multi-layered, reform areas. There's credit, it's the probably head of African Credit Rating Agency, which is Finland, African Union. There's a Pan-African payment and settlement system which is being developed. There's an African Financing Stability Mechanism which is also being developed. African Development Bank's African Green Bank Initiative. The point here is, even in the poorest continent, there are potential at the regional level to create and grow instruments. I want to skip the debts area and come to the conclusions that underpins our business. The first one is a strategic and coordinated focus on domestic resource mobilization is a must. And 2, strengthening developing country voice and impactful coordination at all levels in international institutions for as much as this is possible is important. But in particular, this voice must be generated at the regional level, so there's more regional cooperation and South-South collaboration. We should actively promote urgent recognition of climate and systemic risk. I haven't had time to talk about it, but that has been discussed quite a bit. There should be measures to address the high cost of capital and proactively address the liquidity needs. The reform system should also focus on the adoption of systemic and life cycle approach to debt crisis. So it's not just the immediate cost of debt, but it's the whole cycle. With the need to move countries, especially the poorest countries, away from dependence on foreign exchange denominated debt. There should be measures to increase affordable lending by development banks. There should be reform and strengthening the role of the United Nations to drive an equity, sustainable, informed ecosystem. but in particular, it's as a mechanism increasingly as a standard setting entity. And finally, there's a need to strengthen the contribution of private funding at all levels. There are, and this conversation, and there will be many suggestions on how to do so. Thank you.
Yes, so as you know, we can start with comments and questions. Take some. Daniel. Luis. Oliveira, cansado. Daniel.
Thank you so much. Three great presentations. Two questions. One for the last two speakers. I think that what Christopher touched at the end is a dimension that we haven't not quite explored, and I'm not sure whether we should do it tonight, but that's the political dimension, right? The African Union, the level of integration really enables you to explore these additional institutions to complement and safeguard, let's say, the overall economic system and environment. In the case of Latin American Caribbean, the integration in itself is a process that has been in speeds, it's money. So that's something that we should take into account, but because without integration, there cannot be that type of perspective, but there may be something that we can do. Question is, how you perceive the interactions with the pensions funds crisis and the role that they should play, and as opportunity also to reach stabilization. Right? And to our colleague on the first presentation, if I understood correctly, I just want to better understand how you are factoring in leadership, because some of the discussions has been on women-led efforts, and the opportunity for them was also increase capacities or simply be entrusted to have those roles. And the second is the level of remuneration. In most of the cases, it has been shown that even though they manage to reach leadership positions, the benefit they receive is completely different. So I just want to pick your brains on that. I'm pretty sure you have heard about, but I couldn't see it from the presentation.
Thank you, Daniel. Luis?
Okay, I will do a question for each one. We begin with Margaritta. And in the beginning of your presentation, you showed that the renewables energy has increased, followed by increase in the demand of natural resources. I am wondering if you could measure the net effect of this. That means the benefits of the reduction of the emissions compared to the increase of the demand of natural resources. This is hard because one can say this is the price that you pay to develop, but it's fine. It's a price that in the end you have a benefit in terms of the global environment. That is, you know that there are other problems related to renewable energies, as for instance, the wind energy in the northeast in Brazil, how they exploit the owners of the land. There is also other problems. Carola, it's just you mentioned that we should encourage the creditor to lend in local currency. I would like to explore more how to stimulate the creditor to lend in local currency, not in foreign currency. And for Charles, also all the presentation was very interesting. With your presentation, I remember that there are a lot of recent studies about the called frontier energy markets that are low-income countries that recently were integrated to financial globalization. And what the figure shows for these countries is that they are increasing a lot, so as Carola showed us, and they pay the high premium risk that you show SAC's work that related to the low income per capita income of country, right? And the burden of the financial debt is very high in this country. So in this case, the net effect is very bad for this country. That most financial crises in the last 10 years occur just in most this economy. But just to think about, but on the other hand, particularly on the African economies, they don't have a developed financial markets, and so that's maybe one of the reasons that they increase, and also most of this external debt is related to the public debt. So you have this problem of original sin related to particularly in this country, because emerging markets, in general, they are reducing the participation of the debt, public debt denominated in foreign currencies. But it's not the case of this routine. That's most part of them is Africa. There is also some small countries in Latin America, Asia, and so on. So, on the other hand, you have a very developed financial market. What do you think would be the solution? That's I like very much this idea that finance is a domestic problem. Mostly when you have an increase of public debt in general, you have a problem. So just to think a bit about this sort of thank you.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, I have the first question for Charles regarding the credit rating agency. I think that you also give an example of African credit rating agency. I think that's a great idea to have more transparent credit rating agency. But do you think that the bond issuers of the financial actors, how can we make that they also start to use the criteria of different credit rating agencies? You know, like the three keys of this credit rating agency. So if we create that, how we can move the use?
Bill, thanks for the presentation. So, question maybe can answer for the problem with the debt. I think isn't about Spain, because usually the INCs or the actor, the different correlation with the trade of the debt, the relation with the is focusing the level of the debt on relation with the spending. Yeah, but the problem I think is about the income. Yeah, because the neoliberalism destroys the capacity of the state to generate income. Because privatization, and now the state in the global south only is regulator or supervisor of the American market, but the state doesn't participate in the production, right? For the reason, I think that it's necessary for strong the state like constructor of the infrastructure. So, but okay, we saw yesterday with the Eduardo. It's common like that the different countries, specifically in Latin America, doesn't have capacity to build project. So, and how we can situation. So we need a bank or institution or regional institution for development of the infrastructure, because the countries doesn't have the capacity to build the new infrastructure for the energy generation or the use of this energy. So, and this is a point. So, another point is the relation with the alternative of the financing, like for example, a coal or an oil can afford maybe $1 for a volume of the exportation of the coal, or I don't know, maybe we think in this kind of tools for the finance some alternative in the region, in Latin America or in the global general.
Okay, thank you. So, in the order you want to start?
I can take it. Okay, so you said on the one hand there is a pension guidance, on the other hand suggesting that we mobilize pensions for the basic investment. How do you square the brackets? The problem with pensions across the African continent is twofold. One, insufficient per capita incomes. Second, insufficient formal employment from which most of the pensions funds are generated. So it's actually a development problem. And of course, there is a management problem on the pension funds overall. But because the overall per capita incomes are low, pensions have not yet failed in that sense. They simply are not growing as fast as they could in a more vibrant domestic market. There are discussions about how you pool these pension funds across countries, so they have a wider scope for investment. And that's where these regional integration processes offer as an opportunity. So we have an ECOWAS market of pooled funds rather than only a Ghanaian market, which is small. So that's one way to look to approach it. Nevertheless, still put together pension funds, insurance funds, and capital that sits with commercial banks, put together dwarfs any other forms of capital flows into the continent. So looking at them all as a pool of capital rather than segregated sources of capital could enhance their sustainability and viability. And it is these sort of elements that we are looking at using the regional integration entities as a pillar for doing that. But the bottom line really is growing a domestic economy that is structurally resilient going forward. And that also relates to the question about frontier. I mean, the limited size or limited resilience of domestic financial markets. They are the poorly developed domestic financial markets in these so-called frontier economies. They all became frontier not because the structures of their economies have changed. Most of them really, there were two things that happened when they were graded by the World Bank into low middle income countries. One, it coincided with the commodity boom. So, like parts of Latin America, is very commodity dependent. The commodity boom increases overall GDP. And so when GDP was rebased, many of these countries basically passed the threshold. And that was convenient because then they suddenly became a source of international capital. The solution to this question lies in you can't build in sequencing adequately, not financial market first, but the productive sector first, making state-owned enterprises function as an absorber of capital for which domestic financial market can grow upon. So in terms of that sequencing, the focus has got to be to address the problem inherited by neoliberalism or imposed by neoliberalism, which is dismantle state-owned enterprises. And by dismantling state-owned enterprises, there is no natural absorber of domestic capital. Everybody imports going forward. And if in that process, then domestic financial capital, domestic financial institution can be built. I wanted to make a very quick point for 1 minute on the question of local currency. You asked Carola, local currency borrowing. I think this is quite critical. When you are an economy which is dependent on commodities with very volatile markets, your flows are very procyclical in many ways. Borrowing in foreign exchange imposes double costs. It imposes the direct interest rate cost and it also imposes the exchange rate cost. And these countries are suffering these dual costs. That means there has to be efforts to reduce the second cost, which is the exchange rate cost. I think very traditional Keynesian thing. But in doing so also means paying attention to macroeconomic stability, bringing inflation down. And many of these countries have made a good effort at bringing inflation, domestic inflation down. And with that, there is the potential to actually increase domestic borrowing, that is borrowing in local currency, and reducing the need for borrowing in external currency. But when we reduce borrowing in domestic in external currency, you also prioritize the export sector in a sense. I mean, you first do two things simultaneously. You encourage export to address your exchange rate needs. You encourage investment to address your foreign exchange needs, but you reinvest local currency in domestic production capacity. And that's where so-called modern monetary theory, Keynesian thinking on finance becomes more and more important.
Well, I think Chris has already answered most of the questions, but I would like to make a comment on what you were saying about integration, regional integration. I spoke about the fourth International Financing for Development Conference. 10 years ago, there was the third, and tax was the key issue at that moment. And there was a push from global countries to have a UN tax convention, and it was blocked then. But after that, the African group remained in the United Nations demanding this, and now it's a reality. It's a process, it's an ongoing process within the United Nations. So that shows the power that countries can have if they act in a coordinated and integrated way, which unfortunately is not the case of Latin America. And we have to find a way to have something, a key demand or something that could be common and could be taken. That's why I kind of hopeful about COP30. And next week we have this, you were mentioning the summit of presidents of the Amazon. At least Amazon countries could discuss some key proposal or something to take to like a common agenda or proposal to the COP30. So it's not just a Brazilian COP, but a Latin American and Caribbean COP. That's the opportunity. That's something that we need to work on. Yeah, he referred already to the local currency, but I will give you the example of Bolivia. Right now, Bolivia is running out of dollars. We don't have dollars in the economy, and we cannot pay our debt. And that is also a consequence. We have a lot of local currency, but we cannot really pay our debt. And you can control, of course, these kind of things if your loans are in local currency. You can use monetary policy and to reduce these risks of volatility in the markets and everything. And I'm not sure if I understood well your question, but you were talking about charging $1 to oil activities, and that is exactly what we are going to discuss in this UN tax convention, for example, how to start taxing and really making fossil fuel corporations pay. Right now in the negotiations, they don't pay anything, they just bluff and do lobby towards their favor. And now we have this kind of other instruments, and we can push for the use of tax justice instruments within our countries and at the international level. We can. It would be an important way to mobilize funding to the climate funds that are already in place or other ones that could be more effective. But that's the idea of also charging the ones that are creating the problem that right now are not being resolved.
Okay, so I think that I have maybe 1 minute before we should get the room. So very quickly, then when I was thinking in leadership, female leadership, I'm mainly focusing on public spheres. In Brazil, at least, we have a huge problem of representation. You know, in the parliament, we have less than 12% of the seats with women because of the way in which the democracy is thinking and so on. So, for example, women are not discussing tax reform. Women are not in the discussion of how to build this Brazilian industry plan and so on. So I think that the representation, of course, we have this problem. In private sector, the participation of women is much less than the participation in average occupations, and the wage gap is huge. It's higher than in a normal, regular position. But in the public, not in the public, because in the public is better, but in the governmental spheres, the participation is really low. And for example, as Carola said, we need tax reform. And nowadays in Brazil, the biggest problem is how to deal with this proposal of tax reform, and we are with the parliament, which is really right-wing. For sure, if more women were there, the parliament will certainly is more could be more social including these considerations. So the numbers are terrible in Brazil, like in the rest of Latin America. In Brazil in particular, we have these quotas, which is vacancies for women, which are not fulfilled at all. So this is a big problem. Then regarding the Fernando, I think that it could be interesting, but I don't know if it is a very valuable effort to measure the reduction or the costless of the net reduction vis-a-vis a rise in the demand. I was just focusing on that because I think that the fact that much more different minerals are into the equation, we have much more dangerous situation and potential dangers arising. But I don't know if we have a cost of having more minerals in the production of electric cars and so on. I don't know if if this is a problem per se. I think that the problem is the potential danger that arises from it. So, and I know that was not addressed to me, but I want just to remark the fact that as we speak before, there is a huge tension between green development, the international agenda, that I think that Carola also put on the fact that they are pushing this structural fiscal equilibrium and the fact that most of the Latin American countries are facing this huge external constraint. So the fact that the only way to deal with this debt pressure, I love your presentation because it's impressive. It's very well. It's a very good explanation for the Argentine situation as well as Bolivia. I think that Brazil is in a different path because of the characteristic of the huge reserves and so on, and that the debt is mainly private debt and in local currency. But for us, for the rest of us, the situation is terrible. The pressure for the dollars is huge, and the tension with this green economics and development in the context of the IMF pursuing these agendas of very neoconservative and neoliberal agendas and so on, it's a very difficult horizon.
Okay, so thank you very much, you three. Just as final words, in the name of Oliveira, Luis Fernando de Paula, Sergio Paez, Leonardo Rojas, and myself, we would like to thank you all very much for being here, participating yesterday and today in the workshop. We think it was a very interesting experience for everybody. We hope so. Second thing, we would like to thank our partners, friends, and sponsors. So we would like to thank IDEAS, Young Scholars Initiative, Corecon, the Institute of Economics here in UFRJ, the Center for Sustainable Finance, CEFIS, the Center Celso Hurtado, and Flaxo from Argentina for being part of this as well. Again, as final words, I just wanted to highlight all the constraints we have been discussing here in these 2 days. If an Italian philosopher, Antonio Gramsci, said that we have to have the pessimism of intelligence. So, for example, today, Eduardo was talking about the lack of planning in Latin America. Diego was talking about the market penalties we face if you want to have a radical agenda, for example, in our countries, the fiscal rules in Brazil, in Colombia, and other countries, that we don't have enough money to sustain and finance sustainable transition. Laura talked today about the promise of the imports of technology from the global north that we need to face the sustainable finance challenges. The promise of green bonds that, for example, yesterday Iago and Yuri were talking about. Also Nicolas, who's here. The problems of the banks, the central banking programs that Lorena highlighted yesterday. Well, Carola, she explained it very well, and Margaritta was saying the same thing about the problems. But we have the optimism of willingness. So in that side, we also mentioned this today about the need for reform of the financial architecture. Charles was talking about, he made some interesting remarks on that. The innovative instruments that Daniel highlighted also today in our meeting, the opportunities for southern countries that Laura was talking about today, the big push idea, the gender challenge in this big push idea that Margaritta and Camila mentioned these days. I think we all agree in a global south agenda. And for example, we were talking about financing the just transition, and why not taxing the rich, for example, for that initiative. And Carola was saying today that next year there will be a United Nations Convention on Tax. So that will be something for our agenda. So at the end, the idea that came up today with the creation of a network for these purposes, I think it is an interesting agenda, a challenging agenda, but as Daniel was saying today, we have the capacity at least to intervene in the political discussion. Hopefully, if we have the political power, not only here, but also in the streets and other places, we could do it. So thank you all very much. Congratulations for your participation here. We were thinking about going to have dinner, so everybody can join. Probably, we're going to the same place as yesterday, Galdoma. So we have to organize, fix a couple of things here, but in a couple of minutes, we're going there. So everybody in line.